Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 231, Confederate Leaders in the Sub-Theater of the War. Last week, we had an analysis for two key subordinates of Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman and George Gordon Meade. While I think, at first glance, these individuals were very different, on a deeper dive, they are a little bit more similar in their records than we might have assumed, and they share a lot of similarities, especially when they get to elevated command as well. This week, we turn the pendulum back to the Confederate side. We're going to take a look at the leaders of the sub-theater of the war. Of course, before we do that, let's talk about our Patreon content, and as of the recording of this episode, we should be rolling out with another memoir review. This one's going to be actually a scout in the Union Army, and there was a series of articles that have been put together into a book. There's not very many, actually, memoirs or reminiscences of being a scout. Not very many of these guys, number one, operated, and number two, not very many of them wrote things down, so we have this a little bit of a different look. And it's an interesting side of the war, I think, that we don't often think about when we think about individuals in their service. So we do have that. We have some movie reviews, some other memoir reviews, pictures, slideshows. Any of that sounds interesting to you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. Now, the first thing I think we need to run down is that anything but the main theater or the eastern theater of the war is usually put on the back burner. Not only is it not really the main focus of Civil War histories in certain cases, but it's also not really upfront in contemporary sources either. But why exactly was that? Well, we have kind of talked about this in our narrative episodes, but there are a variety of reasons for this, and a variety of reasons as to why the Confederate Army fails here. We can address the first, in that we need to think that a majority of the population of the United States is still on the East Coast. Proximity to the people and proximity to the capital is going to elevate the importance of what is happening in Virginia. This is also reflected in the major battles of the war. The top 5 battles in terms of troop strength are going to be in this theater, so going beyond the casualty counts, we can see that more eyes are just going to be there as opposed to the West. You have to think, too, that there is a lot of, as we've mentioned in some of our recent episodes, there's a lot of trading in terms of periodicals. You know, we've talked about it in our narrative episodes in the past about how the Civil War is very unique in terms of American wars, in that this is probably the first one where the majority of individuals are going to be able to read and write, and reading and writing is going to be a pastime that is going to sustain the soldier, especially in downtime. So there's going to be a lot of reading of newspapers, of letters, of whatnot, and the more that you have concentrated on this particular area, you can kind of see the increase in that interest in this particular theater, right? So even if you are, let's say, a Confederate or a Union soldier, then you're probably also reading the papers that are talking about your theater as well. You're more interested in that. So we can even kind of hone it in even further in terms of why there's more emphasis there on the main theater, the East, if you will. President Lincoln, of course, is going to be very concerned with the defense of Washington, and honestly, an all-out effort to capture the capital and force legitimacy on their rebel state by the Confederates would not really have been a bad idea. So yes, we can understand that as well. But what advantages did the Union have in the West and the sub-theater? Well, for one, from the outset, they have more professional officers than the rebels. Remember that the regular army is all out west, so a shorter distance to get into the action. There is still a manpower advantage there as well. The Midwest is able to provide large amounts of troops, where the East can still provide soldiers. A case in point example is that Pennsylvania had provided an entire corps almost of troops to the Army of the Potomac and their reserves. That frees up Illinois and Ohio to send more troops abroad. There is an even excess in eastern regiments that wind up in various places throughout the sub-theater. Remember, we talked a little bit about Vicksburg in one of our mini episodes in terms of the Illinois Monument and how it was being renovated. And there were certainly a lot of Illinois regiments serving in that particular campaign. But we also kind of talked about how there were some Pennsylvania regiments that kind of pop up. And they seem sort of out of place in terms of how that army was constructed. But remember, these are the more populated states. So if Pennsylvania is forced to actually put all of their troops into the Eastern Theater, then maybe there's a little bit of a difference there. But they're not. They actually have excess troops to be able to send abroad, and that's going to free up additional troops to go and serve in the army, and that creates that manpower advantage. Supply will also be a huge advantage for the North. When it simply comes to food stores, they will be able to draw once again on the Midwest. We mentioned before, part of the economic fallout from the war is a pretty strong self-sufficiency in these states in terms of agriculture. This was a trend that was already probably on the way prior to the outbreak of the conflict, but no longer did they have to rely on the produce or the farm stock that the South was shipping north. Supply for the South would be tricky. We might have talked before about how the South does have a decent amount of supply, but they are lacking in terms of the logistics to get it to the places that it's needed quickly. Remember, there's a kind of trickle-down effect that will occur from Lee's army. He is drawing supplies from as far away as Atlanta, where Bragg's army, when campaigning, is in a situation where Atlanta should probably have been a logistical hub. And he's trying to pull from hundreds of miles outside of their range of operations. Control of rivers would be tied into this for the North. Even in a situation where railroads would be sparse compared to the East, they would be able to have river traffic in order to sufficiently supply armies. This would be doubly important as they get deeper into the South. Now, we've talked before as well, especially as, spoiler alert, not to kind of reveal what's coming next, I suppose, but we're going to redo Fort Donelson, and one of the big importances of that is the control of the river, right? The Confederates are actually able to get troops to that area fairly quickly because of this river traffic. If the river is open to them, then logistically they probably have an easier time of it. And that's why there's all these battles, especially as we get into the latter portion of 1861, 1862, where river control is really going to be important. So we have kind of these smaller scale engagements, whether it is Fort Henry, obviously that was a problem for a lot of reasons for the South, but a main reason is that they're losing that control of the river. The last reason why the subtheater is different, in my opinion, and the most popular, is that the generalship is less. This is going to be the subject matter of our episode today. I want to take the three main officers besides Albert Sidney Johnston and talk about their tenures as Army commanders for the Confederacy. Now, I do note that I have been kind of putting off Albert Sidney Johnston for quite some time. If you have been listening to these episodes, you might have noticed that, but it is definitely on the list of episodes that I want to do in the future, is really talk about Albert Sidney Johnston, because he's such a fascinating character, I think. In many ways, there's kind of like this very mixed opinion about him. Before, let's say, the modern era, in terms of some of these histories that I've read, there's kind of like this pass that he gets, or even there's kind of this thought process that had he survived Shiloh, things would have been different, right? But really, there's a lot of the modern take on it is that it probably would not have been so, right? Because already at Shiloh, we're starting to see what it's really going to be if Albert Sidney Johnston retains command. But, you never know, right? You probably can kind of pick and choose and cherry pick what kind of opinions you want to take about the guy. So obviously that will be an episode down the line. But overall, this is going to be slightly different than the analysis episodes where we really hone in on the individuals, but rather I think we look at the entirety of the lifespan of the Army of Tennessee, then we can really understand the failure in command. We will begin, though, by introducing our officers. Obviously, we have Braxton Bragg, who's from North Carolina, a descendant of Christopher Newport. In many ways, he's going to be in line with the old aristocracy, which leads him to bump heads with those he believes lesser than. Remember that Bragg is definitely going to take that approach when it comes to Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is not only from Tennessee, but he's also not old money. Bragg would attend West Point, moving to serve in the war with Mexico. Now, Bragg was a pretty strict disciplinarian, which will lead to the famous story of him being almost fragged by his own artillery. Whether or not that's true, we do have the famous quote that's given to him of a little bit more grape, Captain Bragg, right? That's actually given to him, is misquoted often, and is misquoted in terms of Zachary Taylor and his bid for the presidency. Much is made of his pre-war career and relationship with Jefferson Davis. Davis, it should be pointed out, did not count Bragg as a personal friend, but was familiar with his quality. I think, too, it is important to notice that Bragg actually leaves the Army, and part of the reason he leaves the Army prior to the war is that he is not really happy with Jefferson Davis as Secretary of War. And Bragg then is going to start out on sugar plantations in Louisiana, and that's going to lead him to a point where, obviously, it is very hard to say if he had not done that, what his leaning would have been, but he's pretty close friends with a guy like William T. Sherman, and Sherman obviously has this more of a affinity, as we talked about last episode, with the South, especially because he's been a failure in the North a couple times, and then he winds up in the South, and he shares a lot of their opinions, but he's going to continue to serve for the federal government, and then Bragg obviously is going to take the opposite, and part of the reason, I think, in my opinion, is that obviously he has these opinions prior to when he leaves the Army the first time, but one of the ways in which he's making his livelihood is that he has a very large sugar plantation. Earlier in the war, Bragg is going to serve in Florida. We talked about the early Battle of Santa Rosa and Bragg's capture of Pensacola. He would join Albert Sidney Johnston and his gathering of forces for the Shiloh campaign. Bragg is actually going to serve as Chief of Staff under Albert Sidney Johnston and perform well at Shiloh, his command being involved in the initial assaults. Once the retreat to Corinth occurs, PG-2 Beauregard will famously leave the Army, opening up for Bragg's ascendancy. I have a letter from Bragg which will show his general attitude and his attempt at gaining some kind of discipline once he takes over an Army command. Beauregard was in command, Johnston having been killed about 1 o'clock and leading back from some retreating troops. Under my orders, we all advanced, having turned the enemy's flank, and we literally swept them before us, capturing his camps, artillery, men, horses, etc. One whole battery brought to me with the officers, men, and horses complete, and marched to the rear as if it was on parade. It was a sight rarely seen, and very impressive. It was now nearly sunset. We were close on the banks of the river, and just above Pittsburgh, the landing place. Under heavy fire from the gunboats, when the order to retire reached me, General Prentice, a prisoner, had told General Beauregard that they were defeated, and en route across the river. The general thought it was best to spare our men, and allow them to go. But unfortunately, Buell came. Our forces were disorganized, demoralized, and exhausted. Hungry, some of them, because they were too lazy to hunt the enemy's camps for provisions. Mostly out of ammunition, and threw millions of cartridges around them, not one officer and 10 supplied his men, relying on the enemy's retreat. It poured rain the third night when we were in it, so that nature was exhausted, and our men dispirited. The enemy, with his fresh troops arriving, in boat after boat all night, met us early, as we got into line. We fought them with varied success for 8 hours, our generals having to lead in person some of the troops. General Beauregard rallied several thousand, and formed a second line, behind mine, and where a part of the way my line gave, he led on the rear. But they would not stand. I rallied and led part of mine back, but it was of no use. No earthly power could keep them up. My staff were imploring me not to expose myself too much, but there was no alternative. About 2 p.m. we commenced the movement back, and retired in good order, though I must say because the Army did not pursue. Our failure is due entirely to one of discipline, and one of officers. Universal suffrage. Furloughs and whiskey have ruined us. If we fail, it is fault of our own. I have predicted the inevitable result from such premise. Our troops were so much mixed that the retreat had been irregular and disastrous. Our killed and wounded left much of our ammunition, whilst tents and officers' trunks filled the wagons. Many lieutenants and captains have baggage enough for a trip to Saratoga. Our men have lost what cannot be replaced. Arms, knapsacks, blankets, ammunition. Several thousand departed the field early and never returned. but the behavior of my troops from Pensacola and Mobile is beyond praise. It is the theme of admiration. All the good fighting, of course, could not be done with them. Some of Johnston's army fought most gallantly, but I must close for tonight, now 11 o'clock, and I'm very tired. Have been 5 days in the saddle. So it kind of gives us an idea here. He's talking about Shiloh just overall, but it kind of gives us a couple of themes, right? Number one, he's going to see that discipline is part of the problem, and he's going to go to rectify that. Now, to the degree to which he actually is rectifying in terms of him being this great disciplinarian, and he's constantly accused of killing people left and right who are doing these infractions in the army, whether that is actually true or not, he does actually set upon to realize that that's the problem and he needs to fix it. The other thing that you kind of get here from the outset is, even though this is kind of a personal letter here that he's writing to his wife, he does kind of want to throw out there, like, I did everything that I could do, right? and I think that's a very human thing, right? For us to be like, it's not really my fault, or like, if it is, like, there are some of these circumstances that are outside my control that are affecting me, and that's why, obviously if it was up to my guys, and if it was just us, and we would have won, and that's kind of how you get some of these statements and letters. And that's kind of where the problem with Bragg comes from, in my opinion, in that even though sometimes it's argued that he's not really looking for this praise, he's looking to kind of write the record a little bit too much, and that could be an issue, especially as the fortunes of the army are going to continue to decline. Bragg would immediately move to making the army a better fighting force. This would have mixed results. Something we need to consider is that morale is going to have a big impact in terms of how an army is going to perform. And Bragg, I don't think, does the best job of really raising the morale in terms of the army. And the problem is that he's put into these tactical situations where he's going to have to give up the field, or otherwise there's going to be things that are going to kind of take some ticks down on the army's morale, and he's not going to be able to really get back in terms of a higher morale. Whereas Robert E. Lee does a really great job of, even after Gettysburg, which is a big turning point in the war. It's a big defeat for that army. It's really their first defeat, if you think about it. At least that's the way a lot of them thought of it. Even Antietam, which I would actually classify as a loss, but Gettysburg happens, and they're still pretty high morale when they get back to Virginia. They still think that they can withstand anything, and that's something that Bragg just fails to inspire. Lee's army does receive better supplies in general, including arms and equipment, whereas the sub-theater army is generally less well supplied. We have a long career when it comes to Bragg. Some will say too long, but it will generally begin with the Heartland Campaign. This would be an interesting but ultimately fruitless attempt to take Kentucky. Bragg is unable to coordinate with Kirby Smith as their two forces move into the Bluegrass State. I've seen it thrown out several times that Bragg lacks an overall plan in his invasion, and it really seems that this is true. He spends much too much time at Munfordville racking up unnecessary casualties. At Perryville, he does not realize he is facing Buell and his entire army. He actually assumes that he's taking on just an isolated corps. Had Crittenden acted decisively, he might have rolled up the Confederate forces and then defeated Kirby Smith piecemeal. As it was, the army would suffer in morale after Perryville, as they thought that they had the field and the victory, and they were retreating unnecessarily. This would be compounded by quitting Kentucky altogether. Now, part of the problem that we can also point out is that there is a fault that we can kind of look at Jefferson Davis, where he doesn't necessarily put Kirby Smith directly under Bragg's supervision, right? Like, it's kind of like they're both acting independently, and they have to coordinate, but they're not able to. Kirby Smith doesn't want to have the armies combine because he's having a good time in his own command, and that's part of the problem. And we can kind of look at the Confederate president and point the finger there. Maybe, maybe not. Obviously, even if Kirby Smith's army had been combined, Buell's army is still going to be numerically superior, although they would be a little bit more on par than what we see at Perryville. That's going to lead us to Stones River. Now, the armies engaged in the battle will be relatively comparable, so I think this has been Bragg's best opportunity and might be his best opportunity throughout the entire war. initial assaults would be successful, and had there been more control over the attack, then they might have actually been able to get a pretty big victory in smashing into Rosecrans' army and dividing it in half. Bragg has a bad idea for an attack 2 days later when artillery is built up, sacrificing Kentucky troops unnecessarily. Bragg really could hold a grudge, and he was not one for inspiring his immediate subordinates, as they were usually pointing fingers at him. Now, there is a lot of back and forth in terms of, did he actually meaningfully sacrifice these Kentucky troops because he's pissed at how Kentucky happens and how Perryville rolls out. There's a lot of people that have said, yes, he was actually kind of angered by that, but there's a lot also people who say, obviously, he wouldn't have been able to, or wouldn't have been willing to sacrifice these troops just because of that. Post-failure at Stones River, we have the Tullahoma campaign, where Bragg is unable to meet the maneuvers of Rosecrans. He then gives up Chattanooga without a fight and pulls his army into Georgia. It would not be until reinforcements under James Longstreet arrive, amongst others, to where he is comfortable in acting offensively, but his execution is again flawed. In some ways, he almost gives over command of the assault to Longstreet, who is unfamiliar with the terrain, having not been present the first day. Chickamauga is a costly victory, and despite it being a win, the morale, again, does not really improve within the army. This, again, is a big failure for Bragg, who is unable to get the army into a better frame of mind. We really can't compare it to the Army of Northern Virginia. As mentioned, even post-Gettysburg, there had already been an established track record, and so there was still confidence. Even post-Overland campaign, all of the rank and file will have faith in Lee. No one had faith in Braxton Bragg, not his generals, and not his rank and file, so he's really in a bad spot. And while that might not necessarily be true all the way around, certainly Bragg had those who supported him, and certainly there were those in the rank and file who did also think he was a worthwhile general. But I'd say there's a pretty large amount of detractors from Braxton Bragg. We have two quotes that illustrate how he could be perceived. Here's what Grant is going to say about Bragg. Bragg was remarkably intelligent and well-formed a man, professionally and otherwise. He was also thoroughly upright, but he was possessed of an irascible temper and was naturally disputatious. A man of the highest moral character and the most correct habits. Yet in the old army he was in frequent trouble. As a subordinate, he was always on the lookout to catch his commanding officer intriguing his prerogatives. As a post commander, he was equally vigilant to detect the slightest neglect, even of the most trivial order. I have heard in the old army an anecdote very characteristic of Bragg. On one occasion, when stationed at a post of several companies, commanded by a field officer, he was himself commanding one of the companies, at the same time acting as a post quartermaster and commissary. He was a first lieutenant at the time, but his captain was detached on other duty. As a commander of the company, he made a requisition upon the quartermaster himself for something he wanted. As quartermaster, he declined to fill the requisition, and endorsed on the back of it the reasons for doing so. As company commander, he responded to this, urging that his requisition called for nothing but what he is entitled to, and that it was the duty of the quartermaster to fill it. As quartermaster, he still persisted, and was right. In this condition of affairs, Bragg referred to the whole matter to the commanding officer of the post. The latter, when he saw the nature of the matter referred, exclaimed, "My God, Mr. Bragg, you have quarreled with every officer in the army, and now you are quarreling with yourself?" There are a lot of sources that I've actually seen that have pointed out that story isn't actually real. Like, Bragg is going to be intelligent enough to not argue with himself, right? But it kind of gives us still an idea of the kind of individual we're dealing with. There were those who probably thought that would have been true, and that kind of does put in a frame the man that we're dealing with. We can at least be sympathetic toward Bragg. The Army would have a big emphasis on holding the field post-major battle. In Kentucky, Stones River, Tullahoma, all of these, the Confederates are forced to cede the field. That now might sound like a whole lot, but in the case of the first two, the rebels were convinced that they had had the better of their enemy. Retreating did a tough hit on morale. In the case of Chickamauga, despite a victory, it was deemed too costly. Bragg is going to remain in command of the army after Chickamauga, but much like in Kentucky, it would seem that he did not really have a plan for a successful siege. He would get involved in the bickering of officers of his army famously. Leonidas Polk is going to be one of the officers who's actually going to be writing pretty constantly to Richmond about how Bragg is not the right guy for the job. Part of Bragg's problem would be that he asked his officers what their opinion was of him, and they were honest. Getting criticized, he would not be able to move past that. He would again be embroiled in army drama, as Jefferson Davis would arrive outside of Chattanooga and hold a conference with the Confederate generals. This is where Longstreet shows that he's incapable of staying out of it, but again Bragg is going to survive his role. He will unfortunately then move Longstreet to this kind of fruitless effort to take Knoxville, where it was probably a better idea to have him stick around with the main army. Chattanooga will happen with the Confederates just not really reacting at all to the Federal movements, the army almost completely being destroyed, if not for Platt Cleburne and his effort at Ringgold Gap. Now, really, we can also point out to the fact that Chattanooga should have been a very strong position for the Confederates on Missionary Ridge, right? Part of it is the flaw in the execution of actually laying out the defenses, and you can kind of see this inactivity as an issue for Bragg, but there's not really a whole lot of things that he can do, right? A lot of people have pointed out to the fact that he could have swung his army into Tennessee proper and really made it difficult for the Union supply lines and force battle upon him at a more advantageous spot. But really, if you're looking at Missionary Ridge, if you've ever been there and you kind of look at it, you're saying, what other advantageous spot could there be if there was some kind of frontal assault here? And obviously, if we had Missionary Ridge fail, maybe things would have been different. Maybe Grant comes up with a better idea in terms of an attack instead of a frontal assault, which he doesn't really authorize in the first place. But Braxton Bragg is going to be out after that, and we're going to get Joe Johnson. Now, Joe Johnson is going to take over for the first half of the Atlanta campaign. We have well documented how Johnson would not be on the same page as Jefferson Davis. Prior to the war, he was the highest-ranking regular Army officer to join the Southern cause, so he was highly touted. After serving in Virginia and being wounded at Seven Pines, which we talked about recently, he would be benched for Lee in the main theater. Now, one of the other things that we do talk about in terms of your what-ifs, Johnson is kind of pining to get back at the Army of Northern Virginia. He thinks he built the Army of Northern Virginia. So what if Johnson had been able to take over the Army of Northern Virginia, serving primarily in a defensive aspect in many cases, in many of these battles, or acting kind of on the defensive but offensively as well, offensive-defensive, right? And what if Robert E. Lee had been sent to the sub-theater of the war? Now that's an interesting what if. Moving to the west, he would have a failed effort to lift the siege of Vicksburg. In a weird way, though, Johnson was sort of the right guy to take over post-Braxton Bragg. We can compare him fairly well with McClellan, where McClellan was not going to waste any lives in a foolhardy attack. Bragg had been quite aggressive in each of his battles until the end. The Confederates were not keen to continue in that fashion. What Johnson brought to the army in this morale boost, he would take away in overall strategy, though. The defensive style of fighting would not bode well for any kind of decisive action and the saving of Atlanta that the Confederate White House wished to see. Kennesaw Mountain would be a Confederate defensive victory with no follow-up and a continued withdrawal. Now, there are arguments that Johnson was trying to set up certain pieces that might have given Sherman pause prior, but the fact is going to remain that he's actually seeing continued failed execution. A lot of sources that you read will point out, these are actually pretty good ideas that he has. He wants to be able to strike at the Federal Army, and if they had succeeded, then maybe, or if they had even gotten off the ground, really, then maybe things would have been different in the Atlanta campaign, and we have a different opinion of Joseph Johnson and how, he's not kind of this only defensive guy. He does act offensively. Seven Pines, a lot of people point to that as him acting offensively. And yeah, sure, but that's Seven Pines. It's not the Atlanta campaign. And Jefferson Davis is going to see this as unacceptable, the fact that Joseph Johnson has withdrawn essentially all the way to Atlanta. And he really needs him to, again, and we've talked about this before, that Atlanta is kind of this symbolic place. It's not really a strategic value anymore, but he really needs him to stem the tide, especially as the election is coming up. We need to make sure that the war is unpalatable for the North. That's what Jefferson Davis is thinking. So the fault of Joseph Johnson is not so much in the strategy and how he's going to continue to have to withdraw because he's being outmaneuvered and he doesn't really have a lot of tools and able to stop that. It is in the fact that we do have this situation where we really need to have something to show for our efforts, and just a continued success of Sherman's army as it rolls, or his army group, as I guess I should say, as it rolls to Atlanta. That's going to be the big problem. I would also throw out the opinion that Johnson is actually prolonging the conflict. He's helping in that he's keeping his troops' casualty numbers down. He's kind of prolonging this campaign, and he's going to get a lot of negative press for that. And the symbolism of the fall of Atlanta is going to be a problem. And I would also throw out, though, that in 1862, the strategy might have been a good thing. He might have been the right guy for the job. But in 1864, it's just something that the Confederacy can ill afford. And for that, Johnson is going to be benched in favor of a more aggressive general. And for that, we're going to enter John Bell Hood. Hood, of course, had cut his teeth with the Texas Brigade in the main theater of the war. He had served with Longstreet and might have been the architect of the rebel attack that breaks the Union lines at Chickamauga. But, much like Gettysburg, Hood is actually going to be wounded in the action, and he's not going to be able to finish out the battle. In many ways, he's going to be a broken man by the time he takes over, for all the wounds that he received, especially the two serious ones at Gettysburg and Chickamauga. Very briefly, he serves in Corps Command for Johnson, where he doesn't really do a whole lot except launches an attack at the Kolb Farm during Kennesaw Mountain. That's going to be just kind of a waste of Southern lives, mostly because he doesn't actually reconnoiter the position first. He just kind of throws his troops into a situation where they're going to run into Joe Hooker and well-entrenched Federals. Hood from the outset was a peculiar choice to lead because he'd only briefly been in Corps Command, so Army Command would be a stretch. Lee is not going to give quite so ringing an endorsement. This is Lee on Hood. I'm distressed at the intelligence conveyed in your telegram of today. It is a grievous thing to change commander of an army situated as it is of the Tennessee. Still, if necessary, it ought to be done. I know nothing of the necessity. I'd hoped that Johnson was strong enough to deliver battle. We risk much to save Alabama, Mobile, and communication with the Trans-Mississippi. It would be better to concentrate all the cavalry in Mississippi and Tennessee on Sherman's communications. We had better therefore hazard that communication to retain the country. Hood is a good fighter, very industrious on the battlefield, careless off, and I have had no opportunity of judging his action, when the whole responsibility rested upon him. I have a high opinion of his gallantry, earnestness, and zeal. General Hardee has more experience in managing an army. May God give you wisdom to decide in this momentous matter. Now, this is a very Lee quote, right? This is a very Lee statement. He also doesn't want to be sent there, right? That's also something that we need to kind of point out, in that Robert E. Lee does not want to give up command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He thinks he's doing the best job that he can with the army that he has. And he wants to make sure that he's not saying none of these guys are good fits for Army command, but he's also kind of saying, he's kind of a good middle manager, right? He's not going to be a good vice president in some ways. And Lee just doesn't come out and say it because he's a gentleman. We also have to consider, once again, that's on the table, where it's like, hey, there's nothing happening in Virginia right now. We need somebody to be sent there pretty quickly. We already sent Longstreet over there, so maybe we send you. So that also would be part of the issue with Lee. Although, again, there is a lot of Robert E. Lee, and we've talked before about how he's not going to just come out and just diss somebody, right off the bat. But this is probably as close as you can get to Robert E. Lee in a written communication, definitely downplaying somebody. Hood would immediately go on the offensive, arguably too early in his tenure as army leader. That's actually something that we really didn't highlight, I think, in the narrative, is that Hood takes over and just immediately kind of throws the army into some of these battles outside of Atlanta. And in some ways, that's kind of like what you want, right? You wanted the guy to come in and change the way that things are happening in terms of this campaign. Joe Johnston had been mostly on the defensive. He hadn't been able to set up anything offensively. Well, Hood is going to immediately come in and execute these offensive actions. even though none of them are really going to work. Morale after these moves is going to fall even further. With Sherman gladly accepting the attacks, Atlanta's fall was probably hastened with the casualties that are going to be racked up. It would be said that the better execution might have led to some victories. Especially at the Battle of Atlanta, we actually do have an opportunity for the Confederates to see some sort of success, but it's just not going to be able to come to fruition. Part of that is the troops that are being used, the troops that are being shifted. Some of them had already fought a battle, fairly recently that didn't work. So you have a couple of factors that are going to go against Hood. Low morale is going to lead to lack of discipline. And a case in point example of that and how Hood is not going to be very effective when it comes to actually managing the army, as Lee stated. A case in point example of this lack of morale is going to be that he's worried about what's going to happen if his army gets his hands on these United States colored troops prisoners that he's taking as he moves his way into Alabama and then into Tennessee, right? But that gives you a really good idea of the deficiency that he's going to show when he's in overall army command. You really can't control them, and he's going to have a problem on his hands when he captures these garrisons. All that being said, still, he puts himself in a tactical situation at Spring Hill that might have been one of the bigger masterstrokes of the entire war, right? He's able to divide up these forces that are arrayed against him. He might have been able to cut off an entire corps or entire wing of this army and then eliminate it. And then Franklin probably doesn't happen, and Nashville becomes a very different story, right? But again, we have kind of this failure here at Spring Hill. That's going to lead to Franklin because Hood's going to feel the pressure. He's going to think that he's being betrayed. And that's something that obviously that's more in line with Braxton Bragg than you would say Joseph E. Johnson. And then he's going to have this ill-advised assault at Franklin that's going to rack up all these casualties. And then Nashville is going to be a disaster. Part of the reason that Nashville is a disaster is because morale has completely plummeted. They're in winter conditions. George Thomas is going to essentially have the same game plan 2 days in a row to defeat Hood. Again, part of that is going to be the execution. There's not going to be, especially on the second day, earthworks that are going to be put in the right spot. They're not on the military crest. And where have we seen that before? We saw that at Missionary Ridge. So obviously that's going to also be a problem. And then you have Edward Walthall and Nathan Bedford Forrest, who are going to save the army from complete devastation. We've mentioned before how it's very difficult for a field army in the Civil War to be annihilated. Like there were armies in the Napoleonic era who were annihilated, right? There's no cavalry charge at the end that's going to destroy these forces. But there are some instances where we get fairly close, right? We have first Winchester as being a great example. Jackson is going to completely rout Banks, and if he had been deployed in his cavalry, Turner Ashby, if he had actually been utilized to the degree that Jackson wanted him to be utilized, then maybe there would have been an even bigger victory on his hands, right? We have the Battle of Richmond in Kentucky, right? Bull Nelson's going to have this very low opinion of these Indiana troops because they're going to be completely routed. It's going to be one of the larger one-sided victories for any army in the war, let alone just the Confederacy. But then we have Nashville as being the great example for the Union side of a situation that's going to just be completely one-sided in terms of a battle, especially 2 days of a battle where Hood might have had that moniker of being the one who sees his army destroyed. We do have a quote here on Hood. And this is going to be the attitude, especially following these battles in Tennessee. General Hood has betrayed us. The wails and cries of widows and orphans made at Franklin, Tennessee, November 30th, 1864, will heat up the fires of the bottomless pit to burn the soul of General J.B. Hood for murdering their husbands and fathers. Hood's actions can't be called anything else but murder. He sacrificed those men to make the name of Hood famous, when if the history of Franklin is ever written, it will make him infamous. The men had a right to be told the truth. Therefore, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and it will surely overtake him. So that's kind of a very strong words about about John Bell Hood. Part of the problem, I think, also about Franklin, too, that we should point out is not so much in that there were all these casualties. You lose a lot of generals, right? Generals who, if they're not turning the tide, really at this point in the war, it's kind of like there's not really a whole lot of hope left. But a guy like Pat Claiborne, right, should have been able to survive the war, in that he has this great service. He has a very interesting take on the enslavement of these individuals and how we need to kind of have this different mindset when it comes to this institution, right? We've talked about that before. And then it's kind of robbed of that, right? There's all kinds of casualties that you get, and it's not necessary, right? As Nathan Bedford Forrest, and we can kind of maybe take it with a grain of salt, because there's a lot of things that maybe tactically Nathan Bedford Forrest is not really on par with. But he does mention how Franklin is not necessary. We can just bypass these defenses, and we don't have to have a battle here. But Hood, again, frustrated at Spring Hill, he's going to throw his army into this situation where there's going to be just irreplaceable casualties. But what final conclusions can we make about Bragg, Johnson, and Hood? Well, certainly I think a big failure is the lack of a spirit de corps we see in other armies. Despite being on the back burner, the Army of the Cumberland has great morale, almost the same as the Army of Northern Virginia, so that the fact that they are the secondary market, so to speak, is lost here. We've highlighted well the disparity in supply, but the disparity in Elan will be, I think, the biggest factor. The less in numbers army in the main theater would always have confidence, but the troops in the sub-theater would be losing confidence probably even as early as the aftermath of Shiloh. That's really the big failure, in my opinion, of these generals, right? In that I think they're all very capable. There really shouldn't be an argument about whether Bragg or Johnson or Hood are not quite so capable. Probably you could say that Hood is not in the best position as Army commander, but they're just going to fail to really inspire. And part of that is victories, right? You got to win. And these guys are definitely not going to be able to win all that much. And even if they do win, in the case of Braxton Bragg or even Kennesaw Mountain, then it's going to be a situation where you're going to really take away from that victory. And part of that is just being in a wartime situation, in a campaign. You're going to have those situations, but you need to be able to turn the tide somehow, and really none of these guys are able to do that. With that, we can go ahead and close our rundown of the Confederate Army of Tennessee and the sub-commanders, not named Albert Sidney Johnston. I think it might be helpful if we had laid out the whole tenure of the Army and very briefly went over it and really cited the problem within the Army itself. Next time, we are going to shift to a different kind of episode. We're going to have a high-level overview of the year of 1861. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.